Shalom, everyone. I'm Maggie Mahan, the Assistant Director for Community Engagement with the State Historical Society of Missouri. We are so excited to launch a new author conversation series highlighting contributors to the Missouri Historical Review, an award-winning scholarly quarterly which has served as the cornerstone of the State Historical Society of Missouri's publication program since 1906. The review features current scholarship on all facets and periods of the state's history. Articles are illustrated with historic photos, maps, and other images drawn from the extensive archival collections of the State Historical Society and other institutions. Receiving the review is a benefit of SHSMO membership. You can visit our website at shsmo.org to learn more and join or renew your membership today. The October issue of the review features Dr. Larry Gragg's article, From the Hell's Brew of Malice, Hatred, and Vindictiveness, the 1906 investigation of George E. Ladd, director of the Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy. Dr. Gragg, distinguished teaching professor emeritus of history at Missouri University of Science and Technology, joins us for a conversation about George E. Ladd, the strong-willed director of the Missouri School of Mines at the turn of the 20th century. He explores how Ladd's determination to transform MSM into a first-rate institution created powerful enemies that led to a contentious investigation. Today, Gragg discusses why he chose to delve deeply into this particular incident while also putting it within the broader context of his research on the school and its history for his newly released book, Forged in Gold, Missouri S&T's First 150 Years. Joining Dr. Gragg is SHSMO Senior Archivist Kathleen Seal, who is based in the Rolla Research Center on the MST campus, where she works to increase access to SHSMO resources. As we get started today, we invite your questions during the program. As we are using Zoom webinar, we will not see or hear you on camera, but we can see your questions come in through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and look forward to addressing those as part of today's conversation. Larry, Katie, welcome to you both. I will turn things over to you.
Thanks, Maggie. As Maggie mentioned, please, if you've got questions, I put them up. We'll try to get them so Dr. Gragg can address those as well. So, Larry, I just want to start out with the title for this article, which, as Maggie put it, you've got that quote in there from the Hell's Brew of Malice, Hatred, and Vindictiveness. That's quite a quote.
It is indeed. It's from the memoir of George E. Ladd, and what he tried to do with that quote was summarize what he thought motivated people who launched this investigation into his leadership of the Missouri School of Mines. He did not see them as folks trying to understand what the truth was. He just saw them in a cabal trying to overthrow his leadership. So that's very typical of George Ladd. That's the way he characterized people who opposed him. So these are his actual words, and if you can see it, we've got a picture here. This is George Ladd. But so where did he say these words? Were they in the newspaper or other? No, several years after he left, about 3 decades later, he saw some references to the history of the campus, and he thought he had not been given enough credit for what he had done.
Right.
On behalf of the campus. So he wrote this, what was an unpublished memoir of his time in Rolla, his 10 years here. And it's a decidedly one-sided account of what happened. And most of the people who rose up against him or raised questions about him, he simply challenged their motives. And this is a sentence I lifted from his memoir.
Gotcha. Okay, so for those who haven't read it, and if you haven't, you need to read it because it's a really interesting story kind of in those very early years of the university here. You know, it had really just gotten started, a couple decades prior to him coming to Rolla. So in the very early years of even his tenure here at the university, he has this very, hardcore investigation that goes into him as a director. What about this particular, because I know you've been working on obviously the history of the university, and I imagine there are any number of stories that really grabbed your attention, but what about this one really drew you in?
Well, there were a couple of things. That's a good question. When historians look at incidents in the past, developments in the past, you're often drawn to strong personalities. And this is a story of very strong personalities. George E. Ladd was a large man, 6'2", very, very athletic, and more than confident. Some people just simply said he was an arrogant man, very strong, willful. He even admitted that he had a very strong, rebellious side to his personality. And the folks that challenged him had equally strong personalities. So that's one element that drew my attention. But it also was a story that helped me understand how the institution was able to continue. Most people familiar with Missouri S&T in 2020 know it as a robust, highly regarded technological research university with almost 8,000 students and over 400 faculty and over 1,000 staff. It's a large presence in South Central Missouri. But at the time George Ladd became the director, it was a tiny, tiny institution, and by any measure, it was a failing institution. Oh, there's a wonderful photo. This is the photo on the left is the very first building on the Rolla campus, the Rolla building. That photo was 1877. And then the photo to the right is one of 3 buildings on the campus. On the extreme left is a building called the Clubhouse. That was the campus's first, quote, dormitory, which became the residence of the director and then ultimately the chancellors. The middle building was a chemistry building. And then again, on the far right, it's the Rolla building. And that's the campus, essentially, when he arrived. There's one more structure you can't see, which would be behind the Rolla building. It was a combination power plant and metallurgy building. And when Ladd arrived in September of 1897, he took a walk around these 4 buildings and he said, oh my goodness, one of them, the power plant and the metallurgy building, he said the walls were so frail he had to put tie rods through them so the walls wouldn't fall down.
Oh, wow.
And there's no running water on the campus. One of the early faculty said there was one well on the campus, and then in the street behind, those 3 buildings was a whole row of outhouses. So he'd come from the city of Atlanta, which was a burgeoning, growing city of 80,000, and he came to Rolla, Missouri, which had at most 2,000 people in 1897. So it's a dramatically different kind of place in 1897 than it is in 2020.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even if you take the history of Rolla itself, it doesn't become a city until 1858. And then just over a decade or so later, you have this huge university, that we know today is established here. So it really hadn't been long that it had been established, even as a community, really. You had some settlement, but as a city itself, it was very brand new.
Mm-hmm.
So another piece of this article that I really found interesting, and I think it really kind of talks more to his character, is that the incident in 1901 with the state legislature that comes to Rolla. Do you mind talking a little bit about that? I imagine you can.
Sure. He was determined that he could turn the institution around. He had to build some allies. One ally was the editor of the Rolla Herald Democrat, Charles Woods. Another ally was an important railroad attorney named Luman Parker. But he also felt he had to have, there's Charles Woods. He's on the left side of that photo. There's a family dinner there. He is the editor of the Rolla Herald Democrat. But he felt it was critical that he have support in the state legislature, and he didn't rely upon the president of the university, Richard Jesse, to do that. He did the lobbying himself, and he had this extraordinary idea. What if I wrote an article singing the praises of the Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy, and I had my good friend Charles Woods print that article, I will then buy enough copies of that issue and send it to editors all across the state, avoiding the urban areas and Columbia, Missouri, and send $5 and ask them if they would write an editorial supporting higher appropriations for the Missouri School of Mines. And 30 of them did. And while he was doing that, he got the idea that so many legislators were unfamiliar with the Missouri School of Mines, they really needed to physically be in Rolla. So he raised money here in Rolla to pay for bringing the entire state legislature from Jefferson City to St. Louis and then St. Louis to Rolla. And he made sure there was an entertainment car on the train, and there was plenty of whiskey on the car.
Always good,
yeah. And they got nice rooms in the very few hotels in Rolla and all their meals. And then he did something genuinely extraordinary. When they arrived, he had a copy of Charles Wood's most recent issue of the paper, and it was a reprint of all the editorials that supportive newspapers had sent in. That's what those legislators, there you go. That's what legislators saw when they arrived in Rolla. And then the day they were here, he took them to the chemistry building, which was that middle building in that earlier photo. And he had earlier told all the students, whether they were in that lab or not, to show up, all 170 students. So this lab is absolutely crammed with students, and it's clear that there's not enough room for them. Then you have all these state legislators, and he has the students do some experiments, and then he dismisses the students to continue talking to the legislators. But what he told the students to do was go out the back door and go to the power plant metallurgy building, and all of you assemble there, and I will bring the legislators over there. So what he was able to do was to make a case. It wasn't an accurate case, but he made a case that the campus is absolutely packed and they need more buildings. Now, the proof that this was a good tactic was that when the legislators got on the train and went back to St. Louis, they were interviewed by the St. Louis press, and many of them said glowing things about the promise of the Missouri School of Mines and how they were absolutely persuaded that there had to be higher appropriations for the Missouri School of Mines. And over the next 5 years, appropriations more than doubled. So it was an extraordinary effort on his part, and he contended with some justification from this example that he stayed ahead of the university lobbyists his whole time here in Rolla.
Right. I mean, it's just an outrageous story.
Yeah.
But he accomplished what he set out to do, really.
Absolutely.
So we've got a couple questions that have come in. So with the internationally renowned elite status of Missouri S&T and the recent record financial donations for the entire University of Missouri system, is he somewhat vindicated? I'm assuming we're talking about George Ladd.
Oh, absolutely. What Ladd was able to do in his 10 years, when he arrived, the enrollment was about 130 students in 1897. And most of those students had been admitted with the understanding they were not capable of doing the higher mathematics and the chemistry and the physics that were required of the degree programs. And by the time he left, there were 210 students. So he had increased by about 50%. And all those students had passed higher entrance exams. So he had a better student body. When he arrived, it was not uncommon for there to be only 1 or 2 students who would graduate in an academic year. But when he left, they were averaging 16 graduates. Wow. And the other thing, and the questioner did pose a really good question. When he arrived, he read an article that had been written by the president of the Michigan School of Mines, one of the peer institutions of MSM. And the president of the Michigan School of Mines said, the school in Rolla, Missouri is really not much more than an academy, a rural academy that's really better suited for agriculture, not mines and metallurgy. It was a very dismissive characterization. But when he left, the year after he left, which was 1907, the president of the Colorado School of Mines did an assessment of mining education across the country. And he said that mining education is not as good as education in other fields of engineering. However, he concluded that the 3 privates, Columbia University, Harvard, and MIT, were doing an excellent job. but also doing a very fine job with the mining schools in California, Colorado, Michigan, Minnesota, and Missouri. So he not only had increased the numbers at the institution, he had dramatically increased the reputation of the Missouri School of Mines. So the person who posed that question, it's a good one. He has been indeed vindicated. Good question.
Right. And this is, so this next question that we have is kind of another one that really ties in here well, because as you mentioned, when, the university first comes here to Rolla, there's that question of why was it even here? So the question is, why was Rolla chosen for the location of the institution, particularly this type of college and not just a regular university?
Good question. There was a piece of national legislation that President Lincoln signed in 1862 to create what were called land grant colleges and universities. And the premise was colleges and universities until then were for the elite classes, and they weren't for the middle and the lower class. And the idea was through land grants from the federal government, states would be able to fund colleges that would provide instruction in agriculture and in what they call the mechanical arts. Well, that gave the state of Missouri an opportunity to incorporate the land grant concept into the already existing University of Missouri, which had opened in 1839. Well, state legislators debated this for 8 years on what to do with this. And they finally decided that there would be a College of Agriculture in Columbia. But there was so much debate about what to do with the mechanical arts part of it that the legislators decided to throw it open to bids. Any county could bid for what becomes the School of Mines and Metallurgy. And there were two good bids, one from Iron County, but the one from Phelps County was a little bit better. They had to provide land and bonds to make sure that a college could get started. So Rolla outbid Iron County. That's how it happened to be here. It could have been, University of Missouri School of Mines and Metallurgy in another part of the state.
Another part you just left out. So in doing this research, what kind of places or resources were you able to find? Just talk a little bit about that process. I know some of us have done some of these historical research, and it's not just a matter of Googling, that's for sure. This takes a lot of work to find all of this and to pull it all together.
I think I used Google twice.
Oh, okay, twice.
The whole process. I needed a date about something, but the best repository clearly is the State Historical Society of Missouri. I mean, it's just a wonderful repository, and I used many sources there, but I also used the University of Missouri Archives, which is the system archives in Columbia, but the Missouri S&T Archives is loaded with material that's germane to this topic and many, many other topics. But it also was an incident that gained statewide attention. So I read dozens and dozens of newspapers to see how they covered this story. Newspapers in Kansas City and in Joplin and in St. Louis, in addition to Rolla and Columbia. So I had an abundance of material. And then the memoir of George Ladd was helpful. I wish that his main nemesis, Henry Hohenchild, an important local architect, had written a memoir, because I didn't get a real sense, there's Hohenchild, I didn't get a real strong sense of his perspective except from quotations that would come from him in newspaper articles. Hohenchild had arrived in Rolla 16 years before George Ladd, and he'd become a very successful architect. In fact, he had designed two of those buildings that you saw in that earlier photo, the clubhouse and the chemistry building. Although when Ladd saw them, he said, "These things look like monstrosities to me," which didn't endear him to Henry Hohenchild. So those were the main sources. And then there were many helpful photos to get a sense of what the place looked like in 1897 and in 1907.
Right. Yeah, you have a lot of these individuals hear just in Rolla that the tension level between these different individuals that, again, you said it was a very small community at that time. They probably had to interact on a regular basis. And I know in your article, you talk about some of those instances being less than cordial. I suppose we could go with that.
One of his biggest supporters, again, was the editor of the Raleigh Herald Democrat, Charles Woods, and Woods did not get along well with Hohenchild either. And there was an incident right before the investigating committee that Governor Joseph Folk sent to Raleigh in January of 1906. In late December of 05, Hohenchild is walking to his office. It's a cold, blustery day, and he's got his coat tucked up, and he's got some books under his arm. And all of a sudden, Charles Woods approaches him and says something and punches him in the face. So you have this prominent local architect being punched in the face by the editor of a newspaper, and Hohenchild responded in kind. He punched Charles Wood, and people who were watching saw these guys grabbing each other by the hair and punching each other in the face, and they end up wrestling into a gutter that was filled with mud. And one of the observers said this place was just filled with blood and mud. And it just shows the level of the rancor that was involved in this split between the supporters of George Ladd and the opponents of George Ladd. It wasn't just a verbal disagreement, it was a physical disagreement. And there was a second fight in February. So and there was a third fight. So this was not just verbal, it was physical.
It escalated to that point. Yeah. The investigation itself wasn't enough. We're also having a personal grudge against each other in these instances. So if you don't mind speaking a little bit about the investigation itself, you mentioned that Governor Folk himself instigated this, sent down these individuals to do the investigation, but what prompted it? What got his attention to make him start this investigation?
Yeah, Folk was nationally known. He was prominent in Democratic Party circles. He was a successful attorney in St. Louis. He got his law degree from Vanderbilt University. There he is. And he had gotten involved in Democratic politics in St. Louis, very strong supporter of William Jennings Bryan and his run for the presidency in 1896. He got elected circuit attorney in St. Louis, and he looked at politics through a particular lens. He was from a very religious background, and he argued that every political question had a moral perspective. And he went after corruption wherever he could find it in St. Louis city government. It led to indictments of dozens of people, and it gained him national attention. And journalists across the country began calling him Holy Joe because of his high moral purpose. And he promoted something when he ran for governor in 1904 called the Missouri Idea. And it was, the notion was that there had to be civic righteousness. People voted people into office because you expected them to do things honorably. And one of his supporters in his run for governor was Henry Hohenchild. Hohenchild had been in the Missouri Senate. He gained a reputation as a fine orator in the Missouri Senate. He had been named the state architect, and Folk was glad to have the support of Hohenchild. Well, Hohenchild and his supporters, including a state representative named Saltz, he had been a probate court judge in Raleigh, and he was in the state legislature. They began looking at what Ladd had been doing. There he is, William Saltz. And by the way, when Ladd wrote about Saltz, as he did with all of his opponents, he was so dismissive of Saltz. He said the man had no brain of his own, that he was an absolute tool of his political bosses, notably Henry Hohenchild. And then he just went further. He said this guy had this large paunch, and whenever you saw him, he had food on that paunch. Well, these two began looking for things that they found unacceptable in Ladd's leadership of the campus. And the one that got the most attention statewide was that Ladd was worried that so many students in in the time that they were not in class or they were not studying, were wandering downtown into taverns. And 8th Street in Rolla was, and that's only 3 blocks away from the campus, it was notable for having one tavern after another. And as I was going through the faculty minutes in our campus archives, almost every meeting, the faculty was punishing students for going into these taverns. So Ladd tried to come up with a solution. He approved the opening of a billiard parlor just off the campus with the promise from the owner that there would be no alcohol. Well, Ladd liked to play pool, so he would often go to the billiard parlor, and there often were students in there at the same time. There's no evidence that they played with each other, but one of the charges that Hohenchild and Saltz brought against Ladd was that he was down there destroying the moral character of the student body by playing pool with students. Well, that was one charge. Another charge was that he was drawing 2 salaries. The World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904 had a mineral exhibit from Missouri, and the first person in charge of that got dismissed, and the commission persuaded Ladd that he was the man to handle it because he had done that. He just graduated from Harvard with a degree in a PhD in geology, and he managed the mineral exhibit for the state of Massachusetts in the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. And the commission knew that. So they persuaded him to handle that for a year, but he continued to draw his full salary for running the Missouri School of Mines while he got this almost the same level of salary to run this exhibit. And he wasn't in Rolla all that much. He was spending a lot of time in St. Louis, plus he had a mine just outside Joplin, and he would on many weekends go to that mine and be involved in trying to develop that into a money-making proposition. There were some other charges. They argued that he was permitting the faculty at the Missouri School of Mines to sell their lectures to students. They charged that sometimes he didn't make it to his classes. And they also charged that he was so busy with everything else, sometimes he didn't make it to campus until noon. I mean, the list of charges just went on and on and on. Then they also leveled charges against his ally, Charles Woods, the editor of the Rolla Herald Democrat. They argued he was the secretary of the executive committee that oversaw the campus, and he made $40 a month for doing that. But he also got the contract to print catalogs and that kind of material for the Missouri School of Mines campus. And there was a state law passed in 1901 that if you were an employee of a state institution, you could not get a contract from that state institution. So they had this long, long list of charges that they brought against both George Ladd and against Charles Woods. And a fairly new newspaper in town, the Missouri Sharpshooter, was very, very useful to both Hohenchild and Saltz in bringing this charge. The J.R. Miller, John Rolfe Miller, who was the publisher of the paper, was constantly charging Ladd and Woods with all these things. So it got to a point where the Missouri Sharpshooter said, what we need now is a Joseph Folk investigation. And that's what triggers the idea that maybe Governor Joseph Folk would call for an investigation of both Ladd and Woods.
Right. And this whole investigation, once it comes to the end, Ladd's still here at the university, but it kind of spoils the whole thing for him. He doesn't last much longer here at the university of his own accord after that.
No, that's right. It was intriguing the way the investigation went. The 5 men on the committee, and the nature of the committee was fairly common. State legislators wanted to know if agencies and state government really needed the money they were asking for. So they had a committee before each year of appropriations to go and visit institutions away from Jefferson City to do an accounting of, are these legitimate requests? So that's the committee that Folk designated to do the investigation. And 4 of the 5 are retired legislators. So they knew the workings of state government. And those 5, along with Governor Folk, showed up on January 28th, 1906. And they had a short walk from the depot in Rolla to the Imperial Hotel, which is where they stayed during the time that they did the investigation. And the way that there it is, there's the Imperial Hotel just across the street from the train depot. The way they ran this, they decided they would have some hearings in the parlor of that hotel. Ladd said it should be done on the campus. It should be done in the largest building on the campus, which still exists, Norwood Hall. And the committee said, no, we're going to do it in the Imperial Hotel. And the first day, they heard from Henry Hohenchild for many hours. And then they heard from the allies of Henry Hohenchild, including some students, some disaffected students, and a Rolla clergyman who talked about, evidently, we never did get to see the testimony, he evidently talked about Ladd and his time in the billiard hall just shortly away from the campus. That was the first day. And while they were doing that investigation, what is intriguing is that Folk decided he'd like to have a tour of the campus. So Ladd takes him on a tour of the campus. And unfortunately, there's no account of what they talked about. It must have been extraordinary for Ladd, who's being investigated by a committee ordered by Joseph Folk, is giving him a tour of the campus. Well, that's the first day. The second day, they give Ladd a chance to answer all the charges raised against him, and they gave Woods a chance to answer all the charges levied against him. Then a whole range of supporters of Ladd came forward to testify. The current mayor of Rolla testified on his behalf. 3 former mayors of Rolla testified on his behalf. The county clerk, Booker Rucker, testified on his behalf, and several students testified on his behalf. So there were 2 full days of hearings in the Imperial Hotel. And the charge of the committee was to come up with a report and submit all of that testimony to Governor Folk.
Right.
So do you want to hear what happens at the end of the second night, at the second day in Rolla?
What happens at the end of the second day?
Well, what's really fun is at the end of the day, they're supposed to be sitting in their rooms writing this report for the governor.
Right.
And all of a sudden they hear this terrible noise outside the Imperial Hotel, and it's at least 200 students who are marching in protest of this entire investigation. And Ladd was very quick to say, hey, I had nothing to do with this.
Right, yeah,
I didn't encourage, he had plausible deniability. He said, I had nothing to do with this. But the students had bought a cheap wooden casket, and they had made an effigy of Henry Hohenchild and put that effigy in the casket, and they were carrying that casket in this protest march. And the march even went around the billiard hall where they had played pool with George Ladd. And they ended up in front of the Imperial Hotel while this investigating committee is deliberating, and they have a funeral for Henry Hohenchild's effigy. And there's a long funeral oration. And some of them had gone to the chemistry laboratory and found the appropriate chemicals. And when the funeral is over, in this open casket, they poured these chemicals, and they lit a match, and it lit up nicely with some vivid colors. And they walked the casket to the railroad pond, which is what we now call Schumann Park. And they pushed this burning casket out into the middle of the pond until it sank. And all the while they're doing this, they're chanting while this investigating committee is trying to deliberate and write their report.
Wow.
And of course, that got statewide attention. It's in many, many newspapers across the state.
Of course. And of course, all those committee members get to go home, but Hohenchild is still in Rolla after all of this goes down.
That's right.
Wow. Yeah. So I know this was just one story kind of in everything you came across in the history of the university, but why do you think this story is so important in the overall picture for it? Like what role did this play in how the university is today? Do you think the university would be where it's at today without George Ladd and this whole, I mean, I know it's hard to say for sure.
Well, it's a fair question, and it's an appropriate question. If I might, before I answer that directly, indicate what happened at the end of the investigation. What did they report? They had a 4-page report, and they turned that over to Governor Folk with lots of pages of testimony, and I looked diligently for the testimony and could not find it in any of the repositories. So if it still exists, I don't know where it is. But I did see the report. In the report, they did say that Editor Woods had acted inappropriately in getting a contract from the Missouri School of Mines while he was an employee. So, they slapped him on the wrist. You should not do that.
Right.
They did conclude that Ladd, despite his protest to the contrary, had habituated a billiard hall in the presence of students, and they thought that that no employee of the university should be doing that. They also criticized him for having those two salaries. They saw that as an opportunity for him to spend too much time away from the Missouri School of Mines. They didn't say that he had broken any laws. They didn't recommend that he be dismissed, but it clearly was a chastisement of the way he had run the campus. And what's curious is that Governor Folk, remember, he saw all political questions through a moral lens. He had promised if the committee found good evidence for the charges that had been raised, he would take serious action. Well, he got the report in early February of '06, and nothing happened until March. And then there's the release of the report in the newspapers, and then nothing happened. Ladd asked for a copy of the testimony. As far as I can tell, never got a copy of the testimony. And Representative Saltz contacted the governor's office saying, well, what are you going to do? Your committee,
right.
Your investigating committee found evidence of malfeasance here. And evidently, Folk told the representative, Saltz, that you need to confer with President Richard Jesse at the university, because I guess he had delegated whatever punishment was deemed appropriate to the university. So Saltz called upon Richard Jesse, and Jesse said, well, it's up to the board of curators to make a decision. So you can see this is being passed around and around and around. And the executive committee that oversaw the Missouri School of Mines did take action. They did say that in the future, no employee of the university should be engaged in politics other than to vote, because Ladd was so ingrained in local politics and state politics. They said no employee of the university should be absent from the university without appropriate approval. In other words, someone like George Ladd would have to get approval from the president of the university. They also said that it was fair to criticize Woods for taking these contracts while he was an employee of the university, and that should not happen in the future. So they did take some actions, but neither one of them were dismissed. Now, to get back to your question, I know old people get off on a tangent and they never directly answer a question, but I do remember the question. What's the significance of George E. Ladd's 10 years in Rolla to the overall history of the campus? What it indicated to me, in putting aside the personalities, in fact, he's a personality I probably would not have liked to be around myself. But what his successes indicate to me is that most institutions need to have strong leadership, strong, effective leadership that represents the campus, because the faculty can't do it, the students can't do it. It's the person at the top who has to be a very, very strong representative of the interest of that particular institution. And that becomes ever more complex when the Rolla campus becomes part of the four-campus University of Missouri system. The complexity early was, well, the Rolla campus has to report to the president's office in Columbia. Well, now there are four campuses involved in the University of Missouri system. So my biggest takeaway from my examination of this is, once again, if you don't have strong, effective leadership at the top, your campus is going to suffer. There had not been strong, effective leadership among the directors who had preceded George Ladd.
Prior to him.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the questions we have coming in, talking a little bit about the investigation and what he was charged with. So most of the practices that Ladd was charged with are common for university students, faculty, administrators today. So what has changed since then to make these behaviors unacceptable? Is it just the time period in which they were living, university policy, both?
So the question is, things that were unacceptable then are acceptable.
Right. So the things that Ladd was charged with are very common occurrences today. You see faculty intermingling with students in a social atmosphere, that sort of thing.
Well, no, that's a good question. In reading what some editorials wrote and what some ministers said at the time, was that parents had sent their sons, and I emphasize the word sons because in 1905 and 6, we had no female students at the Missouri School of Mines. What they argued was they had sent their sons to the university, and it was the responsibility of the university to make sure that their moral character was not damaged. Well, those parents were oblivious to what the students did when they got here. There were some years when a very high percentage of the students at the Missouri School of Mines, 1878, 1884, 1896, had signed a pledge they would no longer drink because they were constantly down at the taverns on 8th Street. That largely ended by the second decade of the 20th century because most of the drinking was then occurring on campus. It was occurring in fraternities. And that becomes the challenge. Most directors, deans, and early chancellors had the challenge of how do you control the consumption of alcohol on campus? So the difference to me is that it became a campus problem. Then it was a problem of students going out into the community and mingling with the wrong elements.
Right.
And another thing that was embedded in that question, I think, is that many faculty members now are engaged in some ways in politics. There's no prohibition against faculty members being involved in a political campaign. They do more than just vote. Sometimes they write editorials. Sometimes they run for office. So that's gone. It would be challenging for an administrator of a campus to hold too large salaries because he would now, as it was then, because he would raise questions of, well, what are you doing for the campus if you're holding a salary from another entity? No, that was a good question.
Yeah, no. We've got another one here that I think is a really good one. Are there additional turning points in Missouri S&T's history that enabled it to now eclipse MU and other better funded peer institutions?
Oh, yeah, good. Ladd leaves in 1907. And the campus had, at that time, about 210 students. It continued to grow. There was one exception. There was a recession in the mining industry, and the enrollment dipped a little bit. But by the mid-19 teens, it looked like the enrollment could not grow anymore because the only degrees offered were in metallurgy, mining, civil engineering, and general science. And as most historians of higher education have pointed out, if that's your portfolio of degrees, you're not going to get much larger than about 250 or 300 students.
Right.
So for the Missouri School of Mines to grow, it had to offer more degrees in engineering. But the president's office in Columbia and the board of curators said you can't broaden that because so degrees in chemical engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, for example, were already offered on the Columbia campus. So if you did it in Raleigh, you would be duplicating what's already being done in Columbia, and that would dilute what we do with state appropriations. Well, the political forces in Raleigh in 1914, 1915 said, well, we're going to fight for the Raleigh campus. And a state senator named Carter Buford pushed through a piece of legislation in 1915, which permitted the Missouri School of Mines to offer chemical engineering, electrical engineering, and mechanical engineering. And when the governor signed that bill, which had overwhelming support in both houses, the president of the university, A. Ross Hill, and the board of curators said, we're not going to implement it because that's the state legislature can't do that.
Wow.
And so there was a court case that got to the state Supreme Court, and the court ruled that indeed the Buford Act was constitutional. So it's, to me, that's one of the most significant moments in the history of the university, because then the campus can begin to broaden what it offers in all the fields of engineering. And in 1926, we also began offering ceramic engineering. So by the late 20s, pretty much the whole array of engineering as understood at that time is being offered in fairly quickly into the 1950s and 60s. The campus here in Rolla is one of the top 1, 2, or 3 institutions in the country granting undergraduate degrees in engineering. In fact, in the academic year 69-70, only Purdue University offered more or granted more undergraduate degrees in engineering, and civil engineering in Rolla had the most in the country. So to me, that's a signature moment, the Buford Act of 1915.
It really changes the trajectory of the whole university, broadens it, and like you said, brings even more individuals to campus, more graduates, everything.
And in the background of that, if I may, there was a continuing effort in the first 2 decades of the 20th century on the part of Presidents Richard Jesse and A. Ross Hill to move all of the technical programs from the Raleigh campus to Columbia. And before anyone concludes, well, these were evil guys, they were trying to look at this rationally.
Right.
Our state appropriations aren't that large. If we combined all of these programs on one campus, it would be a much more efficient use of state appropriations. So there's this tug of war that goes on between the directors of the Raleigh campus and the presidents at the University of Missouri over whether or not the Missouri School of Mines can offer this array of engineering courses. And the university will get finally in 1935 a very aggressive president named Frederick Middlebush, the longest serving president in the history of the institution. He served 19 years. And for his first 7 or 8 years, he did all he could to dramatically limit what the Raleigh campus could offer. And again, he would say, I'm not being, malicious towards the Raleigh campus. I'm just trying to be a good steward of the wealth of the university. But that's not the way the folks in Raleigh saw it.
Right.
Indeed, there was efforts in both 1941 and 1949 to separate the reporting of the director of the campus here to the Board of Curators directly and go around the president's office.
So not even have that connection.
That's right.
We have another question. Was or is there a building or monument named after George Ladd, either on campus or somewhere in Rolla?
No, and when Norwood Hall was finished, it was finished in 1903, there was no name above the front door. If you go by the front door now, you'll see Norwood.
Right.
And many people at the time thought, well, this should be Ladd Hall because he was so significant in turning around the future of the campus. And he decided that it should be named after the uncle of a strong supporter of the campus. So he had the opportunity to name that building after himself, but he turned it down. I'm not aware of anything on the campus that's named after Ladd. I could be forgetting something, but I'm not aware of any.
No, I don't know of anything, but University Archives, that might be a good place to check for that. We have another question. I'm not sure if either of us would know this. Is the original chemistry building that we see in those early pictures part of the present day chem building?
No, I can answer that.
Okay.
Could you go back to that photo, please?
Yeah, that's the one, right?
So it's the middle building, and it was a fairly small chemistry lab. And what happens with that building is there were 2 wings added to it on either end and a second floor added to the chemistry building.
Wow.
And it was the center for the study of chemistry. And then there was a chemical engineering built, which we still have. But this building that we're looking at in the middle with the additions to it burned in 1969 and it was destroyed. And that's when there was an addition to what we now call shrink hall. So the original part of shrink hall was completed in 1941, and then the second part was added after the destructive fire for this original building. And I have some colleagues who are now retired historians who had offices in that building when there was a fire, and some of them lost all their books and all their materials, and others had always kept scorched books on their shelves from that fire.
These are the ones that survived. I can't imagine losing my collection of books. That would be devastating.
That's right.
I would not be okay.
Or all that material is behind you on your shelves.
Right. No,
Yes.
it would not be okay. That's the first thing. That's the first thing Katie's saving in a fire, all of my manuscripts.
Right.
We had, this isn't a question, but it's a really good comment. Seems like someone should name the billiard room at the student union after George Ladd.
Oh, yeah. He would love that, because
it would be very fitting.
he was a very good billiard player. He loved to play that, and he loved to play whist, which is a card game. And I forgot, one of the charges against him was he'd rather play whist than teach his classes.
Teach his class.
That's a good suggestion. You ought to name that billiard parlor in the Havener Center Ladd.
The
Ladd room. Yeah,
the Ladd billiard room. I have to see, who do we need to talk to about this? I did get a comment from the university archivist. She said there is nothing on campus named after Ladd. So
well, if the archivist Debbie Griffith says there is not, then you can put your money.
She knows.
Yeah, he knows.
She knows. So we may have to start, student petition. See if we can't.
That's right.
If we can't get that name Ladd there.
Well, the humanities social science building has no name, so maybe we can make it Ladd Hall.
It's just a very generic name.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see about that. Okay, so switch gears just a little bit. We've mentioned it, Forged in Gold, a couple times, but I know we've got it there in kind of your background. I don't know if you wanted to say just a few words about like why write history of the university. There have been other previous works, of course, they're not up to current day, but what makes this particular publication stand out from previous works?
Well, this one has been done for the 150th anniversary of the campus. It's hard to date the beginning of the campus. There was legislation signed in February of 1870 that there be an institution like this one. But this institution did not come into existence until 1871. So our sesquicentennial we're celebrating from 2020 through 2021. The first classes were November 6th of 1871. There had been three previous histories of the campus, one in 1941, which is a mammoth compendium of pretty much everything known about the institution through then. It's about 1,000 pages. And I drew upon it. There's some wonderful documents that have been reprinted in that book. It was done by a professor of drawing at the Missouri School of Mines named Claire V. Mann and his wife Bonita. And then there was another book written for the 75th anniversary of the campus in 1946. Clarence Roberts was a fairly new history instructor on the campus. It's a much shorter book, about 150 or 60 pages, I think. But the best book on the history of the campus, in my judgment, is the one by Lawrence Christensen and Jack Ridley, which they did in 1982, which is well researched. And they did a number of wonderful interviews with folks as far back as the 19-teens. And I drew upon some of those interviews for the writing of Forged in Gold. So what I decided, it would be foolish to simply redundantly do what Christensen and Ridley had done. So I wrote a book that has one introductory chapter, which is the chronology of the history of the campus, and then the next 10 chapters are thematic. There's one on students, where they come from, what success have they had in their careers. There's one on faculty and staff. A really challenging one to write was, how has the campus made itself more welcoming to female students, African-American students, international students, the LGBTQ community, and Japanese-American students in the midst of World War II? There's a chapter on miners at war. One thing I found in my research is that the campus has just remarkably supported international conflicts. A chapter on minor athletics. There were so many pranks and scandals. I thought I had to include a chapter on pranks and a chapter on major scandals. There's a chapter on which this article deals with, and that is the sometimes awkward relationship between this campus and whomever's president in Columbia and the Board of Curators and the University of Missouri system. And then the last chapter is on minor impact. Who were the extraordinary alumni of this campus? What are the wonderful things they've done for this world and beyond? We've had a big impact on NASA, for example.
Yeah.
So that's the organization of the book.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here, but thank you, Larry, again for joining us. And if you guys haven't gotten a chance, definitely check out the Missouri Historical Review. We've got those in our bookstore, or they're also for members. You can get the article. It's not just Dr. Gragg's, although I highly recommend checking that one out. There's a lot of other great articles in there for you to look at. Yeah, thanks again for joining us, Dr. Gragg, and everybody.
Yeah, and I hope that people learn from this one. You know, if we made mistakes, they can learn from these. But I really look forward to future installments of this. I would love to hear other authors explain how they did the research and what their aims were in writing an article. And I hope this is just the beginning of a whole series of these kinds of opportunities.
I agree.